I'm looking. Here we go. Good evening. I'm Alderwoman Sheila Finlayson. Welcome to our second town hall meeting under the theme of Where do we go from here? Over the past few months, and actually years, we have heard, seen, and some of us have lived the injustices that are occurring in our communities. Annapolis has been spared many of the tragedies that we have seen elsewhere, though not totally. As the state capital, we've taken part in the protest, in the social unrest that has been the response to tragedies of racism in our society. Well, we've seen it, we've heard it, we've talked about it. Well, it's time now to talk about solutions, and that's what this town hall is about. It's about taking actions that can stop the social injustices from continuing in our community. This evening, I've gathered several community leaders to hear their ideas on what needs to be done. And hopefully, by the end of our program, we'll have some concrete ideas and suggestions upon which we can build a foundation for social justice in our community. Well, today, we really cannot leave out the pandemic that has struck the African American community at a higher rate. And in light of the recent violence in our community over the last few days, we probably will get into some gun violence issues also. So let us begin by sharing our special guest with you. This evening, we have two City Council colleagues, Alderman Ross Arnett, with 13 years of experience on the council. Has it been that long, Ross? Who brings with him a professional background as an economist and a nationally known expert on private health insurance and on healthcare use and spending. We have Alderman Rob Savage in his first term on the City Council and has earned his reputation supporting efforts to restore the Chesapeake Bay. To share an educational perspective, Dr. Jeff Mccree, who's a professor at the United States Naval Academy, and I think at Yale, a noted author, and the chair of the Annapolis Education Commission. To bring a cultural arts perspective, we have Mr. Rob Levitt, an organization trainer, consultant, and coach, and the founder of Creating Communities. To fill us in on our youth perspective, we have Miss Kayla Golder, who is a rising junior at Annapolis High School and the only student member of our Annapolis Education Commission. And I hope joining us, oh, I see her, she's here, and joining us to speak on education issues as well as community initiatives, Ms. Nas Afi. Ms. Afi is an organizational specialist at the NEA, the National Education Association, and serves as president of the Annapolis chapter of Delta Sigma Theta. Welcome you all. So let's begin our discussion with the leadership of our city, one of our aldermen, Alderman Arnett. Alderman Arnett, you have lived in at least two other major cities and have seen a variety of issues. So what have you gathered from what you've seen and heard? And where do you think our city should go from here?
So let me start, if I may, by thanking you, Sheila, for inviting me to participate. I watched the last meeting, and I'm fairly humbled to be invited to this august group, and I do very much want to participate. Those that know me will be a little surprised that tonight I'm somewhat at a loss for words, in that I don't want us to get lost in the words. I don't want us to get mired in rhetoric. I want us to move to action. Talk is and always has been cheap, and now's the time to act. I believe what you're doing, Sheila, is conducting an open and honest dialogue that is what we need to move forward. I note that honest dialogue is often risky for participants, but people of privilege must see that risk must be taken and taken now, or we're not going to make any progress. Sheila, you and Kenny Kirby and I have had some fairly straight from the shoulder dialogue. It is sometimes uncomfortable to talk about the realities of life, but if we don't do that, I just don't think we're going to understand each other, and I don't think we're going to make any progress. So again, I thank you for tonight and setting the stage for that kind of dialogue, but I hope move to action. What I know for sure is that we can't keep doing what we're doing. It's not working for anyone. We can't keep shooting fleeing people in the back or front or anywhere else. We can't kneel on prostrate handcuffed persons' necks. We can't continue to use chokeholds on helpless persons. None of us, I think we all are very shaken to the roots and profoundly affected. None of us want to see that continue to happen. But this issue is much bigger than police murders, and I use that inflammatory language intentionally. Much, much bigger and much more subtle and much tougher to get at. So I would like us to discard viewing this as a racial issue. We all have race. So what? Originally, there was one race. We all came from that. We're all Homo sapiens. In reality, what we really are interdependent social creatures. And we all need each other to survive and prosper. It's long past the time to get moving forward, move to action. And that is the question of tonight. Where do we go from here? How do we move to action? We need to look at and understand the real differences between us. And that, in my mind, is not race. I want to start by looking at things like opportunity and a fair game for everyone. We know opportunities are not equal. They vary by wealth, education, family, community supports. We know that we don't have a fair game. We don't have equal access. We don't have tolerance. And we don't have recognition, let alone removal of structural or institutional barriers. I was struck by watching the last meeting by some remarks that Carl Snowden said when he hearkened back to 1968 and he saw parallels to today. He saw the social unrest there today due to the war in Vietnam, but also the civil rights movement, all during a very important presidential year. Today we are battling COVID-19, but we're still in the civil rights protest movement. And again, that's all very important in this election year. The way I look at things, we've been playing a zero-sum game. Your gain is my loss and vice versa. And I think we need to find ways to move to a win-win game that expands the size of the pie, or at least reslices the pie to more equal shares. So returning to the theme of the evening, and I hope we'll get into a good dialogue and lots of questions and answers. What, as an elected official, where am I to go from here? And I think that's a question we all face on the council. I think we have limits, but also powers by virtue of being elected in the city of government. So I have some ideas about where to go, but I'm also more than willing to follow, and I certainly thoroughly enjoyed the lessons I learned from the last meeting, more than willing to follow the direction of those more directly affected in these areas and more knowledge. I am relatively much from the privileged class. I don't feel the day-to-day pinch, but as an elected official, I think I have a responsibility to feel that and to take action. So for me, progress takes honesty, hard work, and yes, Alderman Gay, it is slow in coming, but we must move from talk to action. And I'm here to say, sign me up. I look forward to tonight's meeting and a very active dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman. And before we go on, I should say that we are on streaming live, and those who are watching who may have questions can go to either YouTube or Facebook to the City of Annapolis's page and post your questions, and your questions in turn will be sent to me. And after all of the speakers have had an opportunity to share their thoughts, we'll respond to some of those questions. So thank you, Alderman. Alderman Savage, as I said, you're a relative newbie on the council. You're in your first term. You too are a transplant to Annapolis, but you married an Annapolitan, so you have a good, strong feel for what Annapolis has to offer. What is it that you bring with you from your previous location and your previous experiences? And what is it that you see that we should be doing differently? Where do you think we should be going as a city as we plow into the future? Alderman Savage?
Yep. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Alderwoman, for the opportunity to contribute tonight. And thank you for your leadership in putting these together. And I think I just want to start by saying, I think as others did at the previous event, this is an historic moment for our society. We've finally gotten to the point where a lot of the racial injustices remaining in our society are visible to a vast number of people in this country, well, actually across the world. The killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the countless others is wrong, and we need to have justice. And while we may have a very conscientious and responsible local police department headed by a progressive new chief, Jackson, there's more we can do. And I think, as you alluded to, Alderwoman, I think it'd be a mistake for us to think that what happened nationally cannot happen to us locally. It can. Tragedies like the Capitol shooting show that we're not insulated locally from tragedies that we see happening nationally. And so, as Alderman Arnett said, I think now is the time really for elected officials and others in the community to take action, to seize the moment. And what that looks like is certainly the challenging part, but I think having this conversation is a great first step, and not just for the city council, but the community at large. So as far as the council, I see it as kind of a two-pronged approach. I think we need to do what we can to address the societal inequities that often drive crime and violence. And we also need to lead by reforming, and yes, in part, defunding our police department. And I'll explain what I mean by that, by both in a bit. But first off, the social inequalities. I think this is the more difficult challenge, but there are things I think that we can do to address this. We can continue to take action to ensure that our children are getting equal education, as we have when we took steps to ensure we don't have school overcrowding in the city. We can take stronger steps to ensure that city employees and contractors are getting paid a living wage, and be an example to the many businesses in Annapolis to do the same. We can continue to fund and expand after-school programs for our youth. We can coordinate with other groups to offer job trainings. So we really need to do whatever we can to address poverty, that larger issue there. And the role I see government playing is as a facilitator. So if and when the communities or individuals need support, I'd like to see the city to be there, ready to work with them to enact positive change in their communities. And based on my understanding, some of the local violence is not random, but it's due to community rivalries and other issues. And I'm not really entirely sure, to be honest, how to address this, but I do want to listen to our experts in the police department and the community and just be there for the community as they take steps to address these issues. So the second prong I mentioned was reforming and defunding our police department. And let me just explain that a bit and first I'll get into the reform aspect. And as I said, I do believe we have a good police department, and they have taken a lot of steps to move towards community policing, which absolutely are necessary and I think need to continue. But I also believe we can do better. We must do better. I really don't want to see any kind of tragedy happen locally like what we've seen nationally. Again, we can't make that mistake of thinking that's not going to happen. So what kind of reforms do I think we need to look at? What kind of solutions? So I'm going to go through a list I have. So first of all, I think requiring de-escalation by our officers where possible to eliminate the need for force. We could require warnings before shooting. We could, as Alderman Arnett, I think, alluded to, we could ban chokeholds and strangleholds in all cases. Require all alternatives to be exhausted before resorting to deadly force. We can look at the duty to intervene in terms of requiring officers to intervene and stop excessive force used by other officers and report these incidents immediately to their supervisor. We could ban shooting and moving vehicles. We could require a use of force continuum that restricts the most severe types of force to the most extreme situations and creates clear policy restrictions on the use of each police weapon and tactic. We could require comprehensive reporting where officers have to report each time they use force or threaten to use force against civilians. And our police department may actually have some of these in place, but I do think we need to discuss these more at some point. But so other things, I think officers should undergo quarterly implicit bias and de-escalation training. We could increase probationary period to at least 18 months. This allows for a greater chance of weeding out the bad apples earlier on in the process. We could allow certain misconduct complaints to be disclosed via public information requests. We could establish a clear ban on stop and frisk. Such a policy has been shown to have a detrimental impact on mental health in the communities that were the focus of this practice in New York City. We could restrict use of tear gas. For example, during a pandemic, it's not a great time to use it because it weakens the respiratory system and makes people more susceptible to infections. We look at citations, not arrests. Identify low-level violations that could be resolved via citations. We could ban no-knock warrants. We could look at demilitarization. And the one example I have for this is just eliminating the Annapolis armored vehicle. While it may have its limited uses, which the department does not keep track of currently, by the way, but I'm wondering if that limited use outweighs the risk it prevents to law-abiding protesters in terms of intimidation or potential inappropriate use, or just in general the image it presents. In my mind, it's really the antithesis to community policing and needs to go. We could create more incentives for officers to live in or near the city so they become part of our community. Require that searches only happen when probable cause exists. And last but not least, we could create a civilian review board with independent counsel and full transparency. But now for the defunding part, as I said, I do support defunding the police. And to me, that does not mean zeroing out funding, but it does mean redirecting some of the funds to social programs that can address the social inequities and injustices I mentioned earlier. I don't think the answer to crime is always another armed officer in the street. I think we need to look outside the box and start thinking. And I think that starts with taking an honest assessment of the police department's funding. For years, they've been treated as a sacred cow, meaning that for political expediency or fear, that cutting their funding has just never been mentioned or pursued. And so they just keep getting more and more programs, more and more funding. And what you get after time, in my opinion, are a lot of inefficiencies and bloat. Because when things are held sacred, it means they aren't questioned. It means there's not oversight. And so we've found in the past monies that under previous chiefs that the department wasn't reporting to our finance department. We've uncovered instances where they've double counted the monies. So, and previous chiefs have confirmed this kind of behavior where previous administrations have kind of tried to hide money in those departments, public safety departments. So my point is that really shows, I think, that we can afford to defund portions of the police department and shift those to social services. For example, we could look at moving funding to a new community services office, which I know Alderwoman Mason, you've been championing. I think we often hear from our police chiefs that they shouldn't be expected to provide these kind of community services or mental health services, and I do agree. I think we need to. So I do think we need to redirect that money. That's one reason why I was advocating that we need to defund some of the vacant police officer positions in the budget, because instead maybe we could use that money to hire behavioral health first responders for non-criminal actions. And the third thing, I'm hoping that we can have a dialogue with our police department about where they can cut. They need to be a part of that conversation and to tell us how they can reorganize to meet the times. In the past, when we've tried to have conversations with previous chiefs, we're told that we can't cut anything because gangs are going to take over. Well, I don't buy that answer, and I don't think our current police chief does either. So I do look forward to having a dialogue with him and the department moving forward. So those are some of my ideas. I certainly don't have all the answers. And I'm not saying what I'm offering are the only solutions or even necessarily the best ones, but they are a start. And I want to listen to everyone and learn from the community, from the police department and the chief, from my colleagues on the council, and from everybody in the community as we struggle with how to build a better Annapolis and a better world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alderman. Quite a list. I don't think I can write fast enough to keep up with all of your recommendations. So I'd appreciate you sharing it with me so I can make sure to capture them in our notes. So thank you very much. Our next speaker, Mr. Dr. Jeff Mccree. Jeff, you have been in higher ed for, I suspect, most of your career, but I know that you kept your finger on the pulse of what's going on in our public education system. And as chairman of the Education Commission, that really is our focus. With social injustice impacting our children almost to the same degree as adults, it is something that we have to think about and consider as far as our schools are concerned. So would you share with us where you think we should be going in the future to protect our youth and to bring them up as the adults that we want to see in our community?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sheila, and I appreciate your opportunity for me to speak and as well to share some thoughts on our public education system. I'm the proud parent, along with my wife Jen, of 5 public school students. The third one just graduated from Annapolis High, and we've got 2 more to go. Since we arrived in Annapolis, over 20 years ago, we've tried to lobby very, very hard for improving our public schools. And I'm a data guy. I like to see the numbers, and so I brought some numbers along today that I think should point out some of the equity issues that are very, very important to tonight's discussion. So, Julian, if I could, please, could I ask you to pull up the slide deck? We'll start off with slide number 2. The Annapolis Cluster is a group of schools basically in between the Severn River to the north and the South River down to the south, and it includes 15 different schools, right? 1 high school that all the different schools feed into, 2 middle schools, Bates and Annapolis Middle, and 10 elementary schools, 9 traditional schools, and 1 contract school, the Monarch Academy. Most of them fall inside the city limits, but some of them fall outside the city limits, including the high school, Rolling Knolls, and Hillsmere. The job of the Annapolis Education Commission really is to lobby for all the schools in the cluster and some of the issues that we face. Next slide, please. I'd like to start off with the high school issue. The city council, the county council, the school board are going to be wrestling with one big number here, the number 2120, which is the student population at Annapolis High this past year. Our state rated capacity is 2,086. And with the growth, particularly in our immigrant community, in our Hispanic community over the past several years, as well as people who have come in to take advantage of our programs of choice, including the IB program, ROTC, and others, our numbers have swelled. And so we're now, we're going to be close to 200 students over capacity at Annapolis High. Nobody does well in a school with those type of overcrowding issues. So that's something that we really do need to talk about and address over the long term. Next slide, please. But the issues that I think really are pressing and worthy of discussion tonight are performance of our different ethnic subgroups. Julian, next slide, please. And this really comes out very clearly when you look at proficiency rates in our different schools. Every year or so, every other year, our students are tested in the public schools, and we get proficiency rates in both math and English. Up in the top box, the top left box, you're going to see Annapolis High School proficiency rates for our three primary ethnic groups: Black, Hispanic, and white. And you're going to see, starting at the bottom, the white proficiency is at 73.4%, right, in math, and 77% in English. And amongst the Hispanic community, we see 11.3% in math and 23% in English. And in the Black or the African American community, 7% proficiency in math and 27% in English. So we hear a lot about performance gaps, and they're real and they're enduring, and they've been around as long as I've been looking at the data in the school system. And despite enormous efforts that I think the school system has made to decrease those gaps and increase performance amongst everyone, they endure. Now, one of the troubling aspects of this is that although Black proficiency is 17 and 24% in math and English, when you look down at the bottom orange box in terms of graduation, we're going to see that we're going to see similar performance gaps, right, with white leading at 96% graduation rate from Annapolis High and Hispanic at 77, but the Black rate is at 90%, right? On the surface, if your metric that you're looking at for the health of our high schools and the health of our equity issues is graduation, a 90% graduation rate amongst the Black community, almost, it looks satisfactory, right? But when you peel back a little bit and you look at percent of proficiency, that it doesn't tell the story, right? So 90% graduation rate compared to 17% math proficiency rate, something's wrong, right? And we don't hear about that in our public pronouncements, but it's certainly something that we need to take a look at. Next slide, please. This difference in performance amongst the different ethnic groups isn't just a high school issue. You can look back throughout students' performance throughout the different schools in our cluster, and you're going to see similar things. Here we see Annapolis Middle, although the numbers at our second school, Bates Middle, look similar. We have a white proficiency rate in math of 70.4%, a white proficiency rate in English is 72.1%. But amongst the minority groupings, it's drastically lower. The Hispanic proficiency in math is 12%, and English is 12%. And for the Black and African American community, it's even lower. In math, 9%, and in English, 11%. Next slide, please. And if we go down into the elementary schools, we're going to see similar numbers here. And white proficiency rate at Eastport Elementary, 60% in math and 80% in English. But the Black community, 11% in math and 11% in English. Next slide, please, Julian. So what do we take away from this? Well, the three things that, go back to the cover slide, please, or actually you can take it down now. Three takeaways that I'd like for us to consider as a group of decision makers here tonight is that, I think we've seen that there exist these very, very deep and enduring performance gaps that we need to keep in front of the public, and we need to keep in mind as our decision makers decide issues of budget, et cetera. About 10 years ago or so, there was a meeting, negotiated settlements of county officials and African American officials on performance toward goals. Those meetings seem to have gone away for reasons that I'm not quite sure of. That's one place to start, to rekindle those ongoing meetings, looking at the data and figuring out what we can do to improve it. So that's A. Let's keep this performance gap issue on the front burner, and let's make sure we don't forget about it. Secondly, what can we do? When we see performance numbers like 10, 12, 15, 20%, these are not students who realistically are going to be going on to college. And I really do think that we need to increase our non-college pathway opportunities. Our technical education programs, our non-traditional programs, such as encouraging internships and encouraging other technical pathways. Right now, the county's system is to send all of our technical training down to one of two specialized centers. The Center for Applied Technology South, down adjacent to South River High School, and Pat North, up in the northern part of the county. I've thought for a long time that we can not just increase our offerings for Annapolis High students there, which the school system has done a very admirable job in doing over the past few years, but do some more things in-house, some additional technical training at Annapolis High School. But to do that, we've really got to unload the high school from that overcrowding issue that we started with. So Crofton High School may take some people away, but we really have to address that issue. So A, keep our eye on these enduring performance gaps. B, increase the number of technical pathways for our people who are in school. And then finally, 3, and this is my personal feeling here, I really do think that we as a city need to start thinking about attracting a school program similar to KIP, the program that was here about 15 years ago for a very short period of time and then had to leave for reasons that I still don't fully understand. KIP stands for Knowledge is Power Program. It's a curriculum and a program that's designed specifically for at-risk youth who come from low income and or broken families that may not be getting the parental attention at home that some of the other top performers are doing. And it's expensive, but it's a program that in other cities like New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, these specialized programs have had considerable success. So those are my takeaways. I'll end here. The 3 things that I'd like to put on the table for where do we go from here? What do we do? A, keep our eye on these performance gaps and what we can do to help erase them and reduce them. B, increase our pathways for non-traditional graduates who aren't going to college, but who need some training in the technical trades and real life skills. And then third, seriously consider about bringing a KIP type program to the Annapolis cluster. So with that, Sheila, I turn it back to you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for your very clear 3 points that are all, of course, as an educator, near and dear to me. These are items that may be even more doable than some of the other strategies that we may come up with. So thank you for putting those on paper for us. And particularly for mentioning what happens after they leave the high school and pointing out those very stark numbers with the graduation rate. So, but we'll get back to that. Thank you, Jeff. Too often, we ignore the impact of the arts in our community. Some of us believe that the arts should be included in every decision we make. And I'm sure Mr. Levitt will agree with me when I say that, or as I say that. So, Mr. Levitt, would you tell us where you think we should be going to address these injustices in our community?
Yes, thanks a lot, Alderman Finlayson. I really appreciate you inviting me to be this. I said to the group before you got on, I said, if Sheila asks me to do something, I'm not going to say no, I'm going to be there. And so here I am, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'd like to just briefly start with a story. About 20 years ago, when I was a actively practicing artist and musician, we were funded by the Arts Council of Anne Arundel County to visit schools and perform. One of the schools I performed at with my jazz trio was Tyler Heights Elementary School in the city of Annapolis. And one of the things that we did was we would bring kids up to scat sing with the bands, right? Kind of a cool opportunity for the kids and to be interactive. So I said, who wants to come up? And of course, all the kids raised their hand, and there was this one kid just going crazy a few aisles in. And so we called him up. And as he came up, I saw all the teachers behind him going like this: don't call him up. Now, it's not because they were bad teachers. They were great teachers. But I'll tell you what happened. He came up and he started to scat sing with the band, and he just went into a different place. He was in a different zone. Mm-hmm. He was a kid that was on a mission of discovery of himself, right? So he just went crazy and just did it. He just sounded beautiful. Just a little elementary school kid, right? So at the end of the assembly, I was packing up. The principal came up to me and she goes, "That child has a terrible stutter. He has a terrible stutter." And the teachers were concerned he'd make a fool of himself. And see, that's the thing, that's the power of the arts, right? That's the power of the arts that we're not seeing because we don't have the training or the ability or the creative mindset to see what all children are capable of. Children can do more than we think they can. And it's that fundamental creativity that comes from here and from here that's going to empower children to achieve. Now, so that story took me a long way. I still remember it here over 20 years later, and I founded a nonprofit in Annapolis called the Creating Communities. And because when I left and I packed up that day, that child and what he did stuck with my memory. And I said, I need to put a structure around that. It can't just be go to a performance here and there and touch the lives of people and then go home. There's got to be some continuity and some relationship development. So when you asked me to be part of this tonight, the thing that I kept saying, what can I say? What can I say that's going to touch people? And here's what I came up with. I hope you like it. It's communities that create together, they relate together. And communities that relate together, create together. So here's the thing. I'm for good policy. I'm for good, fair, and just laws. I'm for shaping academic education and getting the metrics and the things that we need. They're important. But what's going to get us there is being relational with each other. It's spending time together. Now, what better way is there to do that than to experience the joy of creating together, innovating together, looking at our work together, discussing it, having the vocabulary to express our feelings. I did a lot of work with Hospice of the Chesapeake. I was the artist in residence at Hospice of the Chesapeake years ago. And one of the programs I put together for them, for grieving people, was When Words Fail. And I think when we see what has occurred in Annapolis in the last few days, with the killing of George Floyd, with the trauma of COVID-19, there's something beyond words that we need to tap into. And that's the arts, that's the creativity, that's the human spirit. Now, when we study culture, we remember the government leaders, we remember the famous people, but we remember the art that was created. We remember the cultural impact. I'm a jazz musician. I grew up listening and studying Louis Armstrong, John Coltrane, Ella Fitzgerald, and how that art moved me to become a better person. So, that sounds abstract. It's not really. How do we do that? Well, the organization I direct, going to what Ross said, let's move beyond the rhetoric. What are we doing? We have programs that we've been running for years now, in some cases, in the Housing Authority of the City of Annapolis. We have after-school arts programs, and I might add that our consistent volunteers for that program are from the Annapolis Police Department. They show up almost every single week and volunteer in our programs. And to see the joy of those kids coming home from after school, coming in and having a great art project with a caring mentor to work with is a great thing. Now, going to some of the points that Jeff made is think about this idea of this, we always hear about the achievement gap and the equity gap. Well, very important things, right? But think about it. Until a child develops agency for themselves, until they take their destiny in their own hands and they know for sure what they are capable of accomplishing and doing, how can they achieve what a bunch of adults want them to achieve? Do you understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. How can kids achieve when adults are telling them what these are the things that are important, but they're not important to kids, right? Until we show them how fun it is to learn. Again, look at the power of the arts. You're creating, you're designing, you're developing, you're thinking, you're developing critical thinking, you revise. All the things that we talk about academically, we do those things in the arts, kinesthetically. We do those things tactily. We use our oral capabilities. We use our visual acuity to develop those things. So I want to make a case really clear. You can see I feel pretty passionate about this. I am tired of people thinking that the arts is going only to a performance or going only to do a one-off project. Those are great things. They're important. But the arts are the fundamental driver of human creativity. And kids need that because arts bring us hope. They bring us joy. They lift our spirits. So before I close, I wanted to say that during COVID-19 in the summer, when many other nonprofits just said, we're going to sit this out, from a moral and ethical point of view, we have served over 70 children with a wonderful online STEM and arts program, many from the city of Annapolis. We have been on site at the Housing Authority of the city of Annapolis. I don't know if you know this, but I don't call it HACA. I'm tired of that term. I don't call it HACA. I address it by the full name. We serve at the Housing Authority of the city of Annapolis. We have safe social distancing arts activities. We also said, we're not in the food distribution business, right? We're an arts organization. And then from a moral, ethical point of view, well, just because we don't do that, our families have needs. So we conducted multiple operations, 2 at Mills Parole, 1 at Woodside Gardens, Oberry Court, Clay Street. We made sure that every man, woman, and child at the Lighthouse Shelter had art supplies. You say, well, what do they need those for? Well, they were basically living in hotels and not everyone would really go anywhere. So what are they supposed to do all day? Well, how about some creativity? How about a way to lift their spirits? How about a way to give them a sense of worth and agency? Now, we are thinking partners with our families. We are not a service organization. We learn from our communities. We're not there to dictate what they do or how they create. What we are resource providers and facilitators. Communities that create for themselves, communities that create and discover their own pathway, they invest in their communities. They grow. They become who they want to be. And I have never met any person for any reason that doesn't want to maximize their potential. So let's give them the art supplies. Let's give them the mentors. Let's give them the after-school programs. We have them at Germantown. We have them at Georgetown East. We have a World Drumming African Drumming program at Georgetown East for several years now. Eastport Elementary, Housing Authority of the City of Annapolis, and we do lots and lots of wonderful work in the City of Annapolis. Now, I will say this about the City of Annapolis. They've been generous to creating communities. They understand what we do and what we provide and how important it is for kids and families to create together. That's why we call it creating communities. Communities that create together, relate together. Communities that relate together, create together. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Rob. And I've written that quote down and you're going to hear it and I will give you attribution because it's yours and it's a perfect example of what you do. And thank you for that lovely story also. You brought in the element that I was hoping. I knew you would, because it's not just in the book. It's not just in the police station. but we'll get to that. Let me make an announcement. I'm getting a few very lengthy comments, but not questions. So those of you who are watching, if you have questions, please be specific in the question you'd like to ask. Our next speaker is our youngest panelist. You know, too often we forget to ask our children what they want or what they need. We assume, and Rob, you alluded to this, we assume that we know what's best for them. And we are raising some of the brightest and most industrious young people in history, I believe. We only need to look around us today to look at the protests that are going on around the country, many of which are being led by the young. And I am very proud to say the young lady I'm introducing to you now is, as I said earlier, the student member on the Education Commission, and she represents my ward. Very proud of her. So let me ask Ms. Golder, speaking for the young, the youth, where should we go from here?
I would just like to thank you for having me here tonight. There's a lot of things I think as a young person need to change, but I feel as a child who in school, I grew up learning about the civil rights movement, and who would think that here in 2020, we would be back here again, basically fighting the same struggles we did 50, 60 years ago. Because realistically, we act like the civil rights movement happened so long ago, but in reality, we can just go ask, me personally, I can go ask my grandmother what it was like living through that time. And as a young person, our biggest concerns is just police. There's other racial things that have happened, but I feel through talking to my friends and how they feel when they're the ones living in, some of them live in the lower income housing, they do have a realistic fear of police. Not saying all police are bad, but there, as someone mentioned earlier, that we do need to address conflict bias. And I don't specifically support defunding the police. I support reallocating, because in 2020, I feel as though we take everything literally. So I don't feel like that's the proper word when we take everything so literally. I feel we should use reallocating funds to help other departments, whether that's with mental health, conflict bias. There's so many things that we can reallocate money that's not being used in the best way, and work on training so that incidents that happen to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other policies can be created to help stop racial bias and everything else that happens in our communities. As a young person who grows up on social media, I feel as though that social media has had a wonderful impact, especially on the Black Lives Matter movement, because we oftentimes hear about what our elders are doing to impact the community, and that, oh, you guys don't know anything. As our generation, we don't know anything. We can't do anything. But in a time like this, we've seen that we have really created a movement that is pushing for change that needs to happen so that our kids and great-grandchildren are not in this same situation 50 years from now. And I just think there's so much change that needs to happen, but we need to go step by step. And I think the first thing that we could do to focus on actual change is making sure that we educate our youth on the power that they have as voting. Being able to vote to elect, as we talked about, the police chief, who is working with the police officers to, whether that's being in the community, what their training is, what their policies are, that could help create change and help promote this fear that young African Americans and African Americans have in general regarding police and safety as their children, because I understand the risk that the police put themselves every day to help protect us from threats. And I feel like we should educate our youth on that not all cops are bad, and that there's just simple things that we can do to help create change, to make sure everyone is safe and everyone feels comfortably and safe. So whether that is making sure that we as youth continue to educate ourselves, or we take that, as Mr. Mccree said, and allocating that into schools, making sure that is a topic in schools that we learn about day to day, not just talking about news that happened in the past, but making sure we are up to date, educating the youth on current information that is happening today, whether that's with pandemics like COVID or with racial problems. I think there's so much we can do. And we as youth have the power to do it as long as we speak up for ourselves and know that adults are there to listen to what we have to say, and that we know that things need to change now, that so this event is not happening, like I said, 50 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Golder. I knew you would bring us to where we needed to be. Thank you, thank you. Our last speaker, and last but not least, is Ms. Naz Afi. Naz, you have been at the National Education Association for, I think, probably most of your career as an organizational specialist. And so you've kind of had your finger on the pulse of what's going on around the country as far as education reform is concerned. But here in our Annapolis community, you've also kept your finger on the pulse of what's going on through your sorority. We often say, let's get the organizations involved, but many of our organizations, and yours primarily, is very much involved in our community. Delta Sigma Theta is very well known and very much appreciated throughout the community. So tell us what you think about where we should be going and what we should be doing to improve our community.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you for this invitation to be on the panel this evening. Good evening, everyone. I would like to just begin by talking about working this together. And other panelists have alluded to that as well. But it's taken a long time, many, many years for us to wind up in the situation we're in. And we're not going to have an overnight fix. And we need to do this work together. So I want to say that our sorority has intentionally partnered, collaborated, worked together with various agencies, government entities, community groups, community leaders in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County to try to model the things that we can get done, but we need to do it together. And we have intentionally been purposefully reaching out to allies, because communities of color, we need allies. We need our allies who are not people of color to speak up, to be with us. And that's been shown, it's been said by the marches, the protesting that has been happening recently. I want to say that we have worked with our youth. We have a program embodied for young Black males. We have our young women who are gems in our Delta Academy. But we've made sure we have tried to introduce them to the social action pieces of the day. We've worked with Delegate Henson. We've worked with the Black Caucus. We've worked with the NAACP. We worked with Connecting the Dots and the mayor's office, the Department of Health, because again, in my head, I cannot separate the education out or this or housing out. They're all in this intersectionality together because one affects the other. And so we've tried to work with various entities. So if we look at, I won't say because I thought the police reform was just very well laid out. So I just have maybe one other thing to add to that around policy, and that is disciplinary action that's taken because of misconduct or abuse of the position. There needs to be a registry within the police department and the Anne Arundel County Sheriff's Department as well, for those officers who have experienced, who have shown themselves to not be on the right side sometimes. Because what happens is, if someone gets suspended, if someone loses their job, they just go to another part of the county. So or another state, so another part of the state. So let's begin to look at that registry. I was also looking at some of the policies and practices, and I've noticed that maybe we need some overhauling and more refined definition of the details, because we use terms like you're not supposed to use unnecessary force. Well, who's defining unnecessary? If I say, well, yes, I had to put my knee on her neck because she was flailing around, that's in my eye. So we've got to get away from some of the subjectivity and have better criteria to define what do we mean by unnecessary? What do we mean by maliciously threatening or obnoxious behavior? That can be an eye behold and can be very subjective. So let's look at those policies. Let's look at the review of the hiring standards and practices. Is there diversity on the panel that does the hiring? I know that there are interview panels. Let's look at that and study that to see if we are having many voices and not just one. I wanted to go into education, which is, as you said, Sheila, is basically what I have been in as an educator, and I work for educators. So I've been across this country, seeing what's going on, how they're feeling, listening to them. So one of the things that I see is in almost every district, that there needs to be an overhauling and needs to be a quick study of the disciplinary practices and labeling of students of color. Students of color are over-suspended. We say that, let's just look at the details, look at the assessment, look at the data, and really see how deep that goes. We're going to have to take a deep dive into suspensions and the labeling special ed. So with suspensions and disciplinary action, we need to maybe look at more peer mediation and train our young people to involve themselves and learn about peer mediation so they can be part of resolving some of the angst that they're having with each other. What about the school placement classes? Who gets placed in IB? How are we doing it? How are we defining that? Who's looking at that? I want to go back to what Rob just said about the arts. So we've done a lot of concentration in the last couple of years on STEM, and it really is about STEAM. We got to stop cutting the arts, cutting the art teacher, cutting the music teacher, cutting the phys ed teacher first, because we are thinking that the other things are so important. But I agree with Rob in that most all children, young people, our students, particularly students of color, they have gifts and talents in other ways that may not have been seen in academics as yet. Math and music are so aligned, it's something we need to help them see. They're all into music. We need to use that, which is their interest and their need to be involved in their music, and show them what the link is, what the alignment is with their academic studies. So as a teacher, as a former teacher, I've always thought about, so if the student is not doing well, what am I missing? Am I missing a need that he has? Am I missing an interest that he has? Am I missing a talent, a gift that he's been given? And I'm not tapping into that. So we've got to do a better job at tapping into that. We have to help teachers learn and practice how to do that. I also want to talk about reaching out to the home. We have to do a better job reaching out to the home. I know it's easy to say, are we having open house night and parents can come, we're going to have to go to parents. We're going to have to see what the need the parent has in the home in order to help their child. And realize that we have them for a certain number of hours, but everything can go for naught if they go home and we can't help the situation that they have at home. We have to do a better job at reaching out and connecting with the home. And I don't want to say parents because sometimes it's not their parents. Sometimes it's grandparents, sometimes it's auntie and uncle, whomever the students are living with. That's who we need to connect. And the student will then see that it's not just school or it's not just home. It's all of us that surround them. Surround them with love and wanting them to persevere and be successful. What are the rules that we have in our schools that have a disparate impact on kids of color? I know that students of color have been pointed out in a dehumanizing way, degrading way, about what they're wearing or their hair. And thank God we have laws around that now. But we need to be careful about that. And we need to help our educators learn more about that. I know that we're in this pandemic and we are all talking about, we know it's real. Some students don't have equipment at home. Some students don't have Wi-Fi at home. Some students don't have enough help at home. So how are we using the teacher aides and the educators together to particularly help students in this particular time of the pandemic? And I know that the Anne Arundel County Public Schools has a global citizenry class initiative that's for 9th grade. We need to expand that for 7th and 8th graders too. Because I tell you, by the time they're 9th grade, they hit high school, we may have lost some of them. So we need to start a little bit earlier. And then I've noticed also that the statistics show that half of the students now are students of color, but yet we only still have 22% faculty of color. I do know though that the school is trying, that the district is trying, that you're going out to HBCUs, trying to recruit. I don't know how often that's happening, but I would say step it up. If you look at everything we're talking about, it's what do we need to start, stop, or continue? So some things we're already doing, we just need to do them better. I wanted to say something about jobs too, because I come from a city, Buffalo, New York, where we use the Model Cities program to help young people 17 and up. They were paid to do on-the-job training to get skills. We need to look at our workforce training because I know that you enroll over 1,000, something like 1,300, and yet when we come around to the end, there are 425 who actually obtain employment. We need to see what's the missing link here. What can we do better there with that? I want to say something else about just an overview. Listening. I think Rob said that too. We don't listen to our youth and we don't listen to each other. So even among leaders of color, leaders who are not of color, we need to listen to each other better. If we would listen, plan, then execute and act on it, then come back to evaluating. Was it successful? Did we miss the mark? What do we need to readjust? We need to do more of that. I understand that there used to be, I'm not sure if I'd call them focus groups or roundtable discussions in the area, in the community. And some of the topics were around education and housing. But we need to pick that up and bring it back. Some of our folks cannot come to City Hall. They cannot get to rallies. They don't have internet to get on some of our town halls. So we've got to go to the people. We've got to figure out how we do that. Or we've got to figure out a way to get them to us. Another thing was there used to be more volunteer boards that folks could serve on. If I'm a single parent, but I care deeply about my children and what's happening to them in the system, then I want to be able to be invited to that table, to have that opportunity to have the conversations. And the conversation is a dialogue. someone else mentioned that earlier. It's not a one-way thing where we're telling, this is what we're going to do. This is what we think is needed. But looking at listening and having a dialogue. And we also need to bring practitioners and leadership together. For as much as we bring the leadership of the school district, the leadership in the police department, we don't bring the practitioners. And it's the practitioners who are working with our young people. That's the one thing that I hear across this land from faculty, teacher aides, bus drivers, all those who are in the schoolhouse, that no one asked them for their opinion. No one asked them about how we should do things maybe a little bit differently when they're with these children and young people every day. They're with the students every day. Bus drivers are with them before they even get to that school, that classroom. But no one ever asked them, what do you think might be helpful? So I want to say we ought to do that more. And we need to have some frank conversations. I'm going to end with having some frank conversations. I think a lot of times we rely on the individual conversations, and you're all right, I'm all right, but that doesn't change policies, that doesn't change practices, that doesn't change legislation. And we have got to have those very frank conversations around doing some anti-racist actions, about looking at our own behaviors, so that we are not, so that we are culturally competent, so that we have ability to interact and identify groups that we should be able to help rise above and help empower. The policies, practices, behaviors, let's think about what the real outcomes are. What do we need to do for the racial healing and for the racial justice? And the last thing is school systems. I've been introduced around the country to some very successful community schools projects, community schools programs, which is different from a wraparound. But community schools have been able to integrate the social services, the health, and the academics all together. Because we know that our students come sometimes, they don't have food, they don't have shoes. So how do we wrap around? They haven't been to see a dentist in who knows when. How do we integrate those services to help our students? So I want to thank you for letting me have a little input here. And thank you, Sheila, for this invitation and this opportunity to be part of community, looking at community solutions.
Well, thank you for participating. And you've given me a lengthy list of a variety of areas. And I wish I were astute enough to go through and kind of reiterate what everyone has said, though I have taken copious notes. But the solutions, the practical strategies, the recommendations, you guys have given us, the city, a litany of options to look at and pursue. At this point, I would like to open it up if you guys have questions for one another. If there's something that you would like to expound on, you would like clarity, or just want for more information, we can take some time right now to do that. Are there any questions from the panelists? I don't see any hands, so I guess not. Naz, I'm sorry.
Ross has his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Ross, Alderman Arnett.
Thank you, Naz. And by the way, Naz, I really appreciated all of your, I hope I can call you Naz. I don't want to be too familiar. I really did appreciate all of your comments, and I think they quite illustrate the value of having this kind of dialogue. But to our moderator, Alderwoman Finlayson, there's a lot of meat here, but I'm trying to go back to my question in my opening remarks, which is, what do I do as an elected official? I hear a lot of things about the school, and they're all good, but that's not a city role. But I'm afraid that's often used as a cop-out for us in city government. And maybe we need to find ways, as you have throughout your tenure on the council, to have a more direct impact from the city to the school board and to the school process. I heard some really interesting issues about equality and the way that students are disciplined. I heard a surprising statement of which makes sense, but I was just surprised by it, that the emphasis on STEM pulls away the resources for things like the arts and physical ed and things like that. Another really important point was that sometimes students of color don't have traditional strengths that are valued in the majority population, but they have a lot of undiscovered talents that it's not clear we're necessarily finding ways to bring to the fore and allow them to thrive. I do want to, and I'll look to your leadership on this, Sheila, and your comments, Rob Savage. I do think that the council very much has to get into this whole initiative of the so-called defunding of police. And I personally, I agree with Kayla. Not sure I agree with defunding. I think redirecting the programs, but I think, and Sheila, you know, because you and I are working on this Office of Community Caring, I think that there has to be more funding in other ways, new ways, to get at these things. The problems we're having in the communities, across the communities, are certainly, we have crime. We've had an unfortunate number of shootings and death recently, but arrest is not the way to solve that. And we have to do the getting into understanding what we can do and supporting the community. And the unfortunate aspect of that is that takes money, that takes investment. And you know, because you are on the finance committee with me, Sheila, finding money for these so-called non-fundamental, non-important kinds of issues is hard to do. And I do think that brings these questions back into our arena as elected officials. And I think that it's very timely. I have some emails right now from the city manager talking about what we can do to talk about the budget process in August. Not my favorite idea, doing it in August, because I wanted to take some time off. But it is time for us to talk about how we reemphasize our city budget, because that really is the resources, the dollars that we can bring to the table. I can admire and support changes in the school system and teaching practices and those sorts of things. That's not my strength. But as an elected official, I think there is something that we can do. There was one last thing, and I'm trying to remember who said it. It might have been Kayla, but it was really, we can have all the rules and resources and everything, but until we're working together, we're not going to make progress. And so I think it's that having the honest dialogue and finding the ways to work together and understand each other better. I think several speakers actually said this. I don't know how much progress we're going to make. Throwing ordinances and dollars at things hasn't worked for the last umpty years. So I don't know why we suspect that it's going to have any more success going forward. So those were my initial impressions. I really thank everyone on the panel for all of the education that I've received through these comments. And I did take copious notes, Sheila, and I will type them up for you so that you can put it into the hopper for all of this.
Thank you, Ross. Would somebody else, I'll respond to Ross, but I'd like to give anyone else an opportunity to weigh in on some of the questions that he raised. Well, I'll start. Your first question, Ross, was how we impact education, since that's a county function. We have, as Jeff said, 12 schools or 15 schools in the city. We have a vested interest as a city in what is happening in our schools. And we want what's good, to perpetuate through all the schools. It's not just the city schools. But there is no reason we can't have a ongoing dialogue with the superintendent to make our desires known. I have been a long proponent of vocational school. Even though I was an English teacher, I taught all the kids, and I taught at South River, and the vocational school was next door. And young people who may have hated English, not me, but the course, would go across the street and thrive. And some of the products that they could produce, a newfound respect for them, but more importantly, they could walk away with a skill. And I believe that we have to focus on giving every young person a viable career when they leave high school. That means they may not be going to college, because everybody's not going to go to college, but they may be going into a career that is a very fruitful one. Have you tried to hire a plumber recently or a carpenter? They get top dollar. And so we're not giving our young people those skill sets so that they can walk into a profession that will allow them to be a viable contributing member of our society. So that is a message that we need to be working on with the superintendent of schools. This is the second town hall. The very first one did include the superintendent and the mayor and the police chief. And one of the school principals, who's also a fraternity member who works in our community. We heard their voices. Carl Snowden was on the panel, the NAACP and the ACLU. So we had that group. This group, I felt it was important to have a closer to the community group. Not that they're not close to the community, but they have their capacity. We needed to hear from a different group. And I agree with Naz, we need to have focus groups, and I'm hoping that will be the next step. This is just the beginning of what I hope will become a real action plan of things that we need to do to move our community forward, whether it's through education, through other social programs. As Ross mentioned, I have been promoting the city creating an Office of Community Caring with a fully certified, master certified social worker that can help us with those social issues that right now we have no one to really address. My funding for that, our funding for that ends on December 30th, I believe, which means between now and then, I'm hoping my colleagues will work with me to come up with funding to continue that department, or to create that department, but to continue that position. You mentioned, as Rob Savage, about defunding the police. And I think you're absolutely right. It's a terminology problem, because I don't think any of us want the police to go away. We understand the important role that they play. But how do we allocate our funding so that the police are taken care of, but our social issues are also taken care of? That young people are not afraid of the police. They look to the police for the assistance that they need, but they also can look to the city for other types of assistance. We're going to have a retreat, I suspect, in the spring or in the fall. And so at that retreat, we need to be discussing how we fund the programs that we want to implement in the city. So Ross, I think we have opportunities to address all of those things that you mentioned in the fall. We just have to decide that they're important enough to do it. And I think that I feel that way. And I think you do too. So we have to get our other colleagues on board to begin this process of creating this strategy for the city. I am going to send out all the notes from everyone to you guys. But equally as important, I'm going to share all of this with the full city council because we're the policymakers. And there are clearly some policies that we need to be implementing. There are strategies and solutions that we need to consider. They're hard, there's no question. They may be expensive, but they are important if we want to move our community beyond where we are today. So, Ross, we need to continue to work to move us forward and to address those concerns that you raised.
And Sheila, if I could also just add, Alderman Arnett, I think when I talk about that dialogue thing and this two-way thing, elected officials can let organizations like ours and other community organizations know the challenges you're facing so that we then can help carry the message to help you do what you need to do. We need to support you and the efforts you're making, as well as asking you to come to the table and listen and hear us. Once you got out and heard the people and you know what you can do and what your limitations are, you need some folks to help support. So reach out and let us know those things.
Another thing that I would like to piggyback off of what Alderman Arnett said is that, we cannot throw money at every situation that we face, especially when it comes to social injustice. Like, for example, us teens are mean to each other. There was an incident my freshman year of high school between Broadneck High School and Annapolis High School that had to do with racial disparity, but the teen, I don't feel, was held accountable enough. It was a situation where Annapolis High beat Broadneck by 1 point in a basketball game, and a student decided to write some very hurtful and use some racial slurs towards our basketball team that I feel that's not something you just think of. It's something that you were taught and learned from a very young age. Kids, we learn to speak by listening to our parents and what they have to say. So she should have been held more accountable because from what I heard, they called the basketball teams in and they had the head coach apologize for her actions. She did not come to the school and apologize for what she said. Yes, she got suspended. And yes, I believe something happened with her college. But there is something about admitting and holding yourself accountable for what you did wrong and learning from that. Because who knows if that suspension and what happened with whatever happened to her college actually impacted her. She needs to know how she truly hurt people who are from that community and how these words are very hurtful towards people of color or other people who just felt that was offensive. Because that's the problem we have today, is holding people accountable. Yes, saying we want you to say you're sorry, but we also want you to learn from your actions from a young age. And I think that teaching people about racial inequality at a young age, even though elementary school is young, is very important because elementary school, I experienced racism in elementary school. It happens, unfortunately, and it needs to be taught to and talked about at that young age, because that is when we truly start to create our own opinions about how we think about other people and what we are seeing on today now, social media and TV, that we're very impressionable and need to learn right from wrong. Not just, you need to raise your hand in class, but what not to say towards people and what is and is okay to say in society nowadays.
Well, Kayla, I am of the old school. And, when I started teaching in 1970 something, standards were different, and young people had a better sense of what their restrictions were. And today we've become lax with that. And so I'm hearing you say, we shouldn't be.
Exactly, because we have to think about this is the future generation. We say we have problems with police now, but think about someone in your class who may be and use racial slurs could be your police officer that pulls you over while you're driving. Mm-hmm. You never know what people are going to grow up to be when they're older and how they can impact your life.
So, Sheila, could I follow on with two things?
Yes, absolutely.
So, Kayla, you've mentioned two words that I think rarely get mentioned or don't get mentioned enough when we're talking about equity and social justice. And I think those are words accountability and responsibility. And so I really appreciate your comments. I'll leave that at that, but I wanted to go back to something that Naz said. But Sheila, I've also been, we heard in the last meeting, the principal from Tyler Heights, and Sheila, it's been very strong with you. You talked about your father's fraternal organization, and Naz, you talked about your organization. And Naz, you began your dialogue this evening by saying we need to work together. And part of working together, I think, is understanding each other better. I have two honorary fraternities, but otherwise I've never been involved in fraternities, but they do seem to be very important, particularly in the African American community. Julie, you have Link Sisters and all kinds of other things. I'd like to understand that more because it does seem like it's a safety net, but it feels like that's something where it could be made more broadly available to everyone. Maybe there can be a sharing and understanding. So Naz, you said, but let the elected officials let your sorority know the difficulties we're having. I love that idea, but I have to be very honest. I really wouldn't know how to do that. One of the things that's happening in this meeting is that's just not part of my awareness. So I think we need to think about that whole organizational support aspect and how we can draw that more to the forefront. That's just a thought.
Well, and Ross, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sheila, and I'll wait till you.
Well, I was just going to say, Ross, you're right on target in that we have been seeking out sororities and fraternities to help in our schools. The principal of Georgetown East was on our last call, and he talked about the programs that his fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, is doing in the Annapolis community. So I'm sorry, Rob, go ahead.
That's okay. I'll try to be brief. I'd like to present two ideas based on some of the things I heard tonight that I hope will be challenging but interesting. The first one is a lot of times I hear like, well, if a child isn't doing well academically or a student's not doing well academically, maybe they belong in like a VOTAC or vocational program, right? That's kind of what we hear a lot of the times. That they might be better with their hands or working on cars and things like that. I'd like to challenge that assumption, and here's why. It's not that it's not true, but have we done everything we can to make sure that that child knows how to write, knows how to do math, knows how to do the things that they need to do based on our ability as educators to differentiate their instruction, right? So in other words, sometimes we think, oh, well, they didn't do well academically. Let's put them in Cat North and Cat South. That may or may not be a good decision. They may have untapped potential that we didn't know how to unleash from them. That's the first thing. And I'm all for those schools. I mean, those jobs pay. I thought about going back and getting one of those jobs. Those are good jobs, and they require a lot of skills. But but let's not sell the potential of children short for becoming artists, creators, innovators, inventors, because there's something that we didn't do to launch them on that trajectory, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is Ross said, what can I do as a city council person? Well, I'm going to tell you how. I'm going to share. Here's what I travel to organizations all over the country. Okay. Here's how I see and county governments and city governments. Here's what I see that differentiates the governments I work with. Not only are they creating policy and laws and budgets and all those things, but they are working together as a team to develop themselves as leaders. And the bottom line is that organizations that have teams that they don't have to agree on everything, they don't have to love each other, they don't have to be friends, but they do have to develop themselves as leaders. Think about it. When leaders get elected, the vast majority are people who are either new to politics or have not had leadership development. I don't say leadership training, leadership development. So the things that I think that we can do is not only create policy together, but learn how to think together, be reflective with each other, and to learn continuously from each other. I'm all for the retreats. I think they're great. Have your retreats. They're great. But learning occurs in the micro moments that we're spending time together and sharing moments of learning with each other. Now, I told you it's gonna be out of the box. Here's the book I want you to read. It's probably backwards.
Regenerative Life.
Yeah, it's The Regenerative Life by Carol Sanford. She is the Jedi Master of organizational development. The book will take your mind and your city council to places that it's never been before in terms of what does it mean to work with people? What does it mean to have the role? Now, you have a role as an elected official. That's the role you play. We answer constituent emails. We make phone calls. We create budgets. Great stuff. You better do that, right? But there's more to it. It's what is the essence? What is the personhood that you bring to your leadership team, and how do you interrelate together in that context?
Excellent.
So, Sheila, step up and defend me. Who has been the one that has said we need retreats? Who has been the one that says we need to develop a shared vision? Who is the one that says we need to be at the 40,000-foot, 20-year out level, not micromanaging the budget?
Yeah,
Rob,
I know.
thank you.
I know
Thank
you have,
you.
Ross. I know you have. I know. That wasn't directed at you. It's directed at any organization that wants that. I know that you're really into that kind of stuff. That's why I brought it up.
Well,
Thank you.
The education system is very good, and I think Naz will attest to this, at organizing people together. I think I got much of my organizational skills from the NEA and NCUEA. And so, we bring with us what we've learned over time. But I do have to correct one thing, Rob. And I'm getting a time check here. I was absolutely not saying that we throw our kids away to the vocational school. Kids that came to my English class, whether they were going to Harvard or going to the vocational school, had to learn Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Just had to know it.
I came to visit you. We did that together.
That's right. Oh,
yeah.
Yes, you came when I had my bad blank boys,
I'm saying that the system needs to be careful that we're making sure that we develop the whole child. And that was not directed at you or anyone in particular. It's just that we sometimes don't see that we haven't seen some of the potential in kids and given them the opportunity to develop that creative side. And then if they want to go on to that, do that. But in other words, let's make sure that we don't close the window of possibility sooner than we need to. I just wanted to say one other thing was two things that I would like to do are I would love to present, and I know Jeff likes data, and I do too. Data doesn't lie. People lie, but data doesn't lie. So, but But what I would like to do is I would like to be able to present our data, our statistics on how the arts have transformed lives of students. We have that data because people ask me all the time, we're not funding arts programs. It doesn't make any difference. They're just having a good time. Well, let me tell you about the data we have, right? So we have that data. I'd like to be able to share that and all the research on how arts makes a difference. The second thing I'd like to do is someone talked about focus groups. Focus groups are awesome and if they're done right. And so I like focus groups, but there's a thing called a charrette. Have anyone heard of that? Where it's not just talking, because remember, words fail sometimes. The loudest voice, and I know I'm doing a lot of talking, the loudest voice sometimes wins the day. But when a charrette, people are creating together and designing the community they want. Creating communities, we're well equipped to lead those kinds of events, either virtually or in person. I'd love to be able to have people design the communities they want to live in. And that way we can really hear, see, and feel the thinking of people rather than just hearing the words.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. That's what I'm thinking too.
Well, thank you, because we've done a number of charrettes on a number of topics over the years, and I can't think of what the resolution was with them, but I think they probably went further than simply talking about stuff. And so, you know, that's where we are. But I just want to say thank you. I think we did have one question for the group. It was about creating communities, Rob. Have you ever thought about doing some of arts classes or crafts on YouTube where parents can pick up kits or supplies, then take them home and watch the kids, and the kids can watch online and learn, or parents can do the project with their kids?
I love that. I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you. In the fall, we're launching our first, what we call family cohort, where we believe that this is generational, that families create together, relate together, right? And so absolutely, please reach out to me on Facebook, or we have our Creating Communities. We have launched a very robust online STEM and arts program this summer for the kids when a lot of nonprofits didn't do a darn thing. We distributed supplies. We mailed over $800 of STEM and art supplies to kids. We had pickup points. We had drop-offs all over the place. So the answer to your question is yes. If you'd like to be part of that, please contact me. We've done all our programs live. We're thinking, we think live is better with the interaction, but we would also consider video. So thanks for your question.
Okay, I think that was our only question. We had a couple of other questions, but they were off topic about small businesses. And I'll pass those on to the appropriate director in the city. If there are no other questions from the panelists, and
Bill, I did ask Naz a question because I would like to find out more about how we tap into all of these organizations. And also, Rob, I'd like to get, if you could email me or text me that book, because I don't know that either. But I am fascinated by all of this community support that's going on, and I do think it may be a great untapped resource.
Sheila, could you help me connect with contact information for Rob?
Yes.
For Alderman later? Okay.
I will put the contact information in the notes that I send to you, as well as the title of the book that Rob showed us.
Thank you,
Okay.
Sheila.
Well, I think that we're pretty much out of time anyway, so this is a good point. I want to thank you all, Alderman Arnett, Alderman Savage, Dr. McCree, Mr. Levitt, Ms. Afi, and Ms. Golder. You guys were awesome. We have some great strategies, some solutions, and hopefully we'll be working together to resolve some of these serious issues in our community. So I say thank you for joining us this evening, and have a good one.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Sheila.
you, you too. Thank you, Julian.